Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the class. Today's chapter, it's chapter 24 on the book and chapter 6 on our class. So the topic for this chapter is the microbial disease, which are related or affect the urinary and reproductive system. Urinary and reproductive system in females are anatomically distinct in comparison to males. However, in males, the two systems share a portion of this, what we call it as a plumbing system. All right, two kidneys connected by uterus to the urinary bladder and urethra make up the urinary system in both genders, in male and female. The kidneys, they help to remove the waste from the blood, excreting them into urine. And then it travels down to the ureters and up to the urinary bladder. And the bladder itself, it stores the urine until there is an opportunity to eliminate it through the urethra. However, the urethra itself, it may be a portal for the entrance of these microorganisms, especially in the female, because female's urethra is much shorter compared to the male. It's about 4 centimeters long, and it exists near the opening of the vagina. Then, in comparison with male, so the male urethra, it's much longer. It's around 20 centimeters long, and it exists at the top, exits at the top of the penis, the genital organ of males. And the urethra in males also functions as part of the reproductive system in comparison with the female's urethra. Okay, in here we have a diagram where it pictures our urinary and reproductive system. And in the picture A there, you can see the structures of the urinary and reproductive system. And the picture B is the anatomy of kidney. And each kidney contains around 1.25 million nephrons. And nephrons, as you know, they are the filtration units, which filters the fluids and it's involved in the production of urine. And they are also composed of blood vessels and a glomerulus that you can see in there, glomerulus, and tubules. So this is basically what comprise the urinary and reproductive system. When it comes to the structures of reproductive system of female, the female reproductive system consists of 2 ovaries, 2 uterine tubes, in other words we call them as also fallopian tubes, a uterus womb, a mucous membrane lined vagina, in other words also is called as a birth canal, and an external genitalia, which includes the clitoris, 2 sets of labia. Labia actually it's a Latin word which means lips, and another opening of vagina. This is what basically comprises the reproductive system of females. And majority of the organisms enter the reproductive system through the vagina itself. Okay, here we have a section view of the female genitalia and urinary tracts. You can see the compartments of it, what we just mentioned. All right, when it comes to the structures of reproductive system of male reproductive anatomy consists of 2 testes, or in other words, we call them as testicles. which basically are located at the external pouch, or what we call it as a sacrum, which is a system of ducts, accessory glands, and the genital organ, the penis. Beginning at the puberty, each testis produces millions of sperms that mature and store in an epididymis, which is a coiled tube, and it's very long. It's around 7 meters. However, it's wrapped. It's in a coil. That's why we call it a coiled tube, and it's located above and behind each testis. In here we have the section view of male genitourinary tract. You can see the epididymis that we mentioned, the coil tube, which is around 7 meters long. So it's behind the testicles, and it's just behind and above the testis. The penis. All right, normal microbiota of the urinary and reproductive system. The urethra normally supports the growth of some microbiota, chiefly avirulent species such as Lactobacillus, Staphylococcus, and Streptococcus, which basically are harmless, do not cause any type of infection. However, occasionally other bacteria such as Mycobacterium, Bacteroides, Fusobacterium, they do colonize the distal end of the urethra. In both male and female, the rest of the urinary organs and the urine in them are exanic, which means they are pure or they lack microbial contaminants, meaning that there is no any type of microbe present. And this is due to the normal acidic pH of the urine and the flushing action of the urination. Microbiota of the urethra do contaminate urine during the urination. For this reason, normally voided urine contains some bacteria, whereas urine collected directly from the urinary bladder via a catheter is typically sterile. So urine itself produced in the urinary bladder, it's sterile, it's asanic, does not contain any microbes. Okay, in both male and female, microorganisms infecting the urethra can rarely move into the bladder, up the ureters, and infect the kidneys. Opportunistic and sexually transmitted microbes also infect the reproductive systems. All right, now we move to the next section where we talk about the diseases of various microbes, including bacteria, virus, and fungi. And we start with bacterial urinary tract infections. All right, about millions of years ago, and many cases of urinary tract infections has been diagnosed annually. And in our days, it's one of the most common infections in United States, and mostly those infected are women. Bacteria may trigger inflammation and pain in any or all the urinary tract, including urethra, urinary bladder, or kidney. These conditions we call them as urethritis, cystitis, pulmonephritis, etc. So depending on the part of the urinary tract that it infects. Urinary bacteria can infect a male sexual accessory organ, such as prostate, and this type of condition, it's called prostasis. Pathogens which are responsible for the urinary tract infections, there are many. The most common one is E. coli, and usually the signs of the symptoms that follow the bacterial infection of the urinary tract are frequent and urgent painful urination, and urine usually is cloudy and foul odor, which has a bad smell, etc. And when it comes to the virulence factor, usually the bacteria contains flagella, like in this case E. coli, which is has a peritrichous flagella, which is covered entirely in flagella, as well as the attachment fibria. That's what gives the E. coli the power to cause the infection. When it comes to the pathogenesis and epidemiology, it often results when the bacteria which is found on the stool or the fecal bacteria is self-inoculated into the urethra. And that's why bacterial urinary tract infections is very common among the females. And when it comes to the diagnosis of bacterial urinary tract infections, it's based on the urinalysis. Urinalysis actually it's a test which is used to detect and manage a wide range of disorders. It's not specifically to the infection, however, that's one of them. And what involves in urinalysis is mostly the appearance, concentration, and it will focus also on the content of urine. And in this case, is looking for the presence of bacteria. In many cases, the infection resolves without treatment. There is no need for any antibiotics to be given. However, it depends on the severity. If the severity is very high, then antimicrobial drugs are provided. Prevention is prevented by limiting contaminations by fecal microbes, and hygiene is very crucial in this case. It depends on the way that the cleaning of genital parts, as well as after the patient or after the person has gone out to the toilet. And in some countries, for instance, they use paper or they use different kind of materials in order to do the cleaning part, and actually that's one of the contributors to this type of infection. Okay, another condition it's leptospirosis, which is I'm sure very common. It's a zoonotic disease. Not all infections of the urinary system originate from fecal contaminants. Some of them, like leptospirosis I just mentioned, it's a zoonosis, which is a disease primarily seen in animals that spread to humans. This causative agent enters the body through breaks of the skin or through mucous membranes and spreads to the urinary system from the blood. The signs and the symptoms, half of the patients develop nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, and 1/3 have a dry cough. Leptospirosis is rarely fatal, but when it is, usually mortality is due to the kidney and liver failure, meningitis, or respiratory disease. So it's not necessarily strictly related to urinary tract. Okay, the pathogen which is involved, there are more than 200 strains of gram-negative spirochete, which cause leptospirosis. And majority of the taxonomists, they have hypothesized that all strains, all these 200 strains of spirochete, they do belong to a single species, which they call it as Leptospira interrogans. And usually it's transferred from domestic animals. And that's why the hygiene of the domestic animals is very crucial on preventing the spread of this leptospirosis. The pathogen itself has a couple of virulence factors, including the adazine. They are motile and can invade complement activity. Okay, in here we have the picture of Leptospira interrogans taken using the scanning electron microscope. And this spirochete, which causes leptospirosis, appear hooked like a question mark. You can see at the both ends there in the picture. All right, humans develop leptospirosis between 2nd to the 26 days following the direct contact with the urine of the infected animals with this spirochete. And usually it's upon contact of the infected animals with the spirochetes in the animal urine, such as contaminated streams, lakes, or soil, and all the environment in which the organism can remain viable for 6 weeks or more. So usually the bacteria stays there for quite a long period of time, almost 1 month. Okay, there are some reports that claim that transmission can be from person to person. However, such a spread has not been observed before. Because Leptospira is thin and is highly motile, it can penetrate and intact mucous membranes or enter through invisible cuts and scrapes in the skin. It corkscrews its way through these tissues and then travels via the bloodstream throughout the body, including the central nervous system, and damages cells lining small blood vessels and triggers fever and the organ signs and the symptoms. Eventually, the bacteria resolves and the spirochetes live only in the kidney. As the disease progresses, the spirochetes are excreted into the urine. Leptospira does not stain well with the gram staining, and therefore a specific antibody test revealing the presence of spirochete in the blood or urine specimen is the preferred method for the diagnosis. The most effective way to limit the spread of the Leptospira is to refrain from wading in, swimming in, or consuming water contaminants with the animal urine. Such as rodent control is also important, but eradication is impractical because the spirochete has many animal reservoirs, and an infective vaccine is available for livestock and pets in order to prevent the spread of the infection. All right, we move on to the next disease, which is called streptococcal acute glomerulonephritis. Okay, for an undermined reason, the body does not remove the circulatory antibodies which are bound to the antigens of some strains of group A Streptococcus species. Instead, this antibody-antigen complex accumulates in glomeruli of the kidney, and it triggers inflammation of the glomeruli and the nephrons, and this condition is called glomerulonephritis. This obstructs the blood flow through the kidneys and leads to the hypertension, which means high blood pressure, and low urine output. In this case, the patient's urine often contains blood and other proteins. Young patients usually recover fully from glomerulonephritis, but the progressive and irreversible kidney damage may occur in the adults. Okay, physicians first has described the Staphylococcus toxic shock syndrome, or STSS, that's what it's referred to, in the late 1920s. But however, in late 80s, the condition became epidemic in the United States among the women, and this is quite interesting because it became epidemic among the menstruating women who use the superabsorbent tampons. I'm sure the females might be familiar with the term. And these tampons, these superabsorbent tampons, they can absorb between 12 to 15 grams of menstrual blood. Some women who experience extra heavy bleeding. So once epidemiologists determined that certain strains of Staphylococcus aureus cause the syndrome, it became known as Staphylococcus toxic shock syndrome. Untreated toxic shock syndrome disease is fatal. Almost 50% of the patient die out of this disease if it is not treated, and some of them will have brain and heart problems, and they will have other vital organs deaths due to the low oxygen supply, a condition which we call it as shock, and that's where it comes from. When it comes to the pathogen which is responsible, like I mentioned, it's Staphylococcus aureus, and which causes the Staphylococcus toxic shock syndrome and produces a toxin, because Staphylococcus aureus is a gram-positive bacteria, and therefore it produces exotoxin. And this toxin is a soluble toxin, which it's released from the cell, and it's called toxic shock syndrome toxin. And these exotoxins, they bind simultaneously to major histocompatible complex 2 molecules on the antigen and antigen presenting cells and the T cell receptors on T cells. However, they bind to sites other than the normal antigen binding sites of the immune system molecules. So when a toxin molecule binds to the defensive cells, or the immune cells, together in this fashion, what leads to the activation of a T cell. As a result, many of these toxin molecules and many of the T cells are activated much more than in a normal cellular immune response. And these activated T cells after that release an overabundance of cytotoxins, which is one of the mediators in the inflammatory response and triggers the manifestation of the disease. Okay. Right. In this investigation, like I mentioned to you before, in 1980s epidemic in the United States, the researchers, they have discovered that Staphylococcus aureus grows exceedingly well on superabsorbent tampons, and especially when a blood-soaked tampons remained in place for a prolonged period. Therefore, the toxic shock syndrome disease occurs in males and females, but most cases have been identified in menstrual females. Physically, sorry, the physically the doctors have diagnosed the toxic shock syndrome upon a couple of signs and symptoms, uh, particularly in menstruating women. In some cases, cultures of the blood sample grow colonies of Staphylococcus aureus. So when it comes to uh, emergency of the disease, it's considered a medical emergency. This is the reason because it can move up to infect other compartments of the urinary tract and reproductive system. Um, for the treatment itself, it requires removal of the foreign material, and antimicrobial drugs are provided. As part of the prevention, it's avoiding the tampons or usually using less absorbent tampons, and this can reduce the risk of infection. All right, in this picture in here, we have the incidence of Staphylococcus toxic shock syndrome in the United States in around 3 decades. And you can see that in the early 80s, when it was an epidemic condition in the United States, the number of cases was very high and it's still present. However, starting the year 2000 or 1998, the number has maintained pretty much on the same level. And like I mentioned earlier, again, at-risk individuals include women who use tampons, vaginal sponges or diaphragms, newly delivered mothers, surgery patients, especially after nasal surgery where packing is employed to reduce the bleeding, and anyone with an infection of Staphylococcus aureus. So there is a group of people who are exposed to the infection with Staphylococcus toxic shock syndrome. Okay, we move to the next condition, bacterial vaginosis. Uh, when it comes to the signs and the symptoms of bacterial vaginosis, a homogeneous white vaginal discharge with a fishy odor characterizes bacterial vaginosis. Some itching, irritation, and vaginal opening may also occur. Up to 50% of the women with bacterial vaginosis, they do report no symptoms. Okay, the pathogen which is responsible, bacterial vaginosis, results when the normal lactobacilli of the vagina are replaced with a large number of facultatively or obligate anaerobic bacteria, such as gram-positive Gardnerella vaginalis or Mycoplasma hominis. These are two gram-positive bacteria which are obligate anaerobic bacteria, and they replace the lactobacillus bacteria, which is normal flora. And scientists, they do not understand the underlying causes of this change in the microbiota. It's still not understood how actually this change happens. When it comes to the pathogenesis and the epidemiology, scientists, they do not know the exact cause or causes of bacterial vaginosis. However, it's associated with multiple sexual partners and vaginal douching. And diagnosis and treatment. Diagnosis is based on the signs and the symptoms, and it's treated via oral or vaginal routes with metronidazole. Okay, in this picture here, we have the presence of clue cells. What the clue cells are, they are vaginal epithelial cells uh, which are covered with bacteria. And in case of the diagnosis, that suggests a diagnosis of bacterial vaginosis. You can see in the picture here, we have the clue cell, which is different from the other non-normal non-clue cells, and it's full of bacteria inside it. The name of the bacteria species that can be found on a clue cell. That's where it gets the name of it. And the reason why it's called a clue cell is because it's like a sticky cell where the bacteria cells are attracted towards it. Okay, we move on to vaginal candidiasis. Okay, we mentioned on the bacterial infections of the urinary tract. Now we're moving on to fungal infections, and the most common and the most famous infection is vaginal candidiasis, and it's a very common term. Candidiasis actually describes any of a variety of opportunistic yeast infections and diseases which are caused by various species of the genus Candida. Okay, and the most famous one is the Candida albicans. So candidiasis can involve any mucous membrane, and meaning like any mucous membrane in the genital area. When it comes to the signs and the symptoms, vaginal candidiasis, it manifests as white mucoid colonies which are growing on the mucous membrane of the vagina, and the skin which covers the vaginal labia. The yeast, which this type of fungi, it's a yeast, it's not a mold. It produces severe vaginal itching and burning, which urination intensifies. Sexual intercourse can be very painful, and the vaginal discharge is often curd-like and slight. Okay, one thing to mention as well is the pathogenesis and the virulence factor. Candida albicans, it's a normal flora of the skin and the mucous membrane, and is the most common species causing candidiasis. In other words, it's considered as an opportunistic, as commiasert yeast, one of the groups of the fungi. And we know that the general rules when it comes to the fungi is that yeast is it's a non-pathogenic fungi in comparison with molds. Yeast, they do not cause infection. However, and yeast are unicellular cells. However, this type of yeast, the Candida albicans, they are capable on forming long cellular extensions which basically resemble the hyphae of the molds, and we call this type of projection as a pseudo-hyphae because they look alike, look similar to the hyphae, to the true hyphae of the filamentous fungi. Therefore, Candida species are common members of the microbiota of the skin and the mucous membrane. Okay, moving to the pathogenesis of the vaginal candidiasis. Candida albicans, like I mentioned, it lives on the vagina. It's home there. That's where it dwells. It lives in competition with lactobacilli and other types of bacteria. If the vaginal pH becomes more alkaline than the usual, or if, for instance, the normal bacterial population are reduced because of extensive antibiotic which has been taken by the patient, Candida can multiply rapidly and take over the place that the bacteria has left, which triggers inflammation and other manifestations of candidiasis. In immunocompromised individuals only, like for instance the HIV patients, Candida can become systematic, can spread throughout, throughout the other body systems. And according to the Center for Drug Control, they have estimated that around 75% of women with experience will experience candidiasis at least once in their lifetime, and almost 50% will have 2 or more episodes during their lifetime. Okay, and when it comes to the Candida itself, it's one of the few fungi that can be transmitted between human to human, meaning like from between the individuals, because rarely we have fungi disease where it transmitted from a person to person. When it comes to the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention, identification of Candida is usually based on their symptoms. Okay, and is treated with azole and fluconazole. These are 2 drugs used in fungal treatment. And how do you prevent the infection from candidiasis? Like what I mentioned under the pathogenesis, one of the mechanisms that triggers the spread is when the place is left empty by the bacteria which has been killed by the overuse of antibiotics. So in this case, avoiding excessive use of antimicrobial drug can prevent the candidiasis. Okay, we move to another disease of urinary and reproductive tract infections, sexually transmitted infections, STIs, as well as STDs. Sexual activity usually transmits microbes between different partners. That's one of the most common ways. When the microbes are potentially pathogenic, such transmission is also known as sexually transmitted infection, STI. Diseases resulting from the STI are sexually transmitted disease, are called sexually transmitted disease, which are also known as venereal disease. A pandemic of sexually transmitted disease has developed over the last 50 years, and STDs are common worldwide diseases. Female adolescent is especially at the risk of STDs in that her cervical lining is especially prone to bacterial invasion. A sexually active 15-year-old girl has 12.5% chance of developing pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID, which is a general term for inflammation and pain in the uterus, uterine tubes, or ovaries. However, at the age of 24, the probability is decreased from 12.5%, which was among the 15 years old, to 1.25%. Okay, when it comes to the prevention of STDs, prevention includes abstinence or mutual monogamy, which means having a relationship or sexual intercourse with only one partner, avoiding with many partners, and other protections such as the use of condoms must be properly and consistently used in order to provide protection. Okay, the following condition, it's gonorrhea, which is quite a common disease out there. Many doctors have known about this sexually transmitted disease, the gonorrhea, for many centuries now. And although the disease was often confused with the syphilis until late 19th century, in the early history, like back to the Romans, one of the physicians, Roman physicians, called as Claudius Galen, he named gonorrhea for what he thought was its cause, an excess of semen, gonorrhea, which means flow of semen, and he used the Greek language for that. So the disease sometimes is also called as clep, from the archaic French word clapper, which means brothel. So basically, they describe the disease, or they name the disease based on the physical appearance. When it comes to the signs and the symptoms in men, gonorrhea is usually insufferably symptomatic. It's which means it's an acute inflammation, typically occurring 2 to 5 days after the infection in the urethra of the penis, which causes extremely painful urination and a purulent. Purulent means a pusful discharge. In contrast, gonorrhea in women is often asymptomatic to majority of women. Up to 50 to 80% of women, they do not encounter any symptoms when they get infected with gonorrhea. They have no symptoms or obvious signs of infection for many years. So for many years, they do not realize that actually they are infected with gonorrhea. It is only when they try to become pregnant that damage to the uterine tubes becomes obvious. It's at that time when they realize. About 25% of women with gonorrhea suffer pelvic inflammatory disease due to it. Okay, when it comes to the pathogen and the virulence factor, Neisseria gonorrhea, a gram-negative bacteria, is responsible. It is also known as 100. It's also known as gonococcus. In other words, that's what they call it, as gonococcus Neisseria gonorrhea. Okay, I mentioned it's a gram-negative bacteria, which usually forms pairs of cells under the microscope, and they do have fimbria. They have a capsule, which basically is their one of the major virulence factors. And because it's a gram-negative bacteria, it produces endotoxin. And it also has a cell wall antigen, which is called lipo-oligosaccharide, which is composed of lipid A. And lipid A is what I mentioned, the endotoxin that they produce, as well as the sugar molecules. When it comes to the pathogenesis, gonococci, or Neisseria gonorrhea, it adheres via their fimbria and the capsules to the epithelial cells of the mucous membranes, which line the mucous membrane lining much of the genital area, not just the genital, but urinary and as well as the digestive tract in our body. As few as 100 pairs of the cells can cause disease. No matter how small, how little they are in their number, they are capable of causing the disease due to their virulence factor. And the bacteria does not attach to the cells lining of the vagina. This is very interesting. Instead, the bacteria most commonly infect the cervix of the uterus. Via fimbria, with the help of fimbria, Neisseria gonorrhea can attach to the sperm cells as the sperm cells swim past, which allows the bacterium to hitchhike to the uterine tubes and beyond, producing pelvic inflammatory disease. And chronic infections can lead to scarring of the tubes, resulting in pregnancies outside the uterus. And babies which are delivered vaginally by infected mothers can as well become infected. When it comes to the spread of it, gonorrhea occurs only in humans, even though previously it was the number of infections with gonorrhea was quite high, now has dropped in developing countries such as US. And however, the risk still is there, increases with the frequency of sexual encounters with more than one partner. Okay, the diagnosis: the presence of gram-negative diplococci in pus form an inflamed penis is sufficient for a diagnosis of symptomatic gonorrhea in men. For the diagnosis asymptomatic cases of gonorrhea in men and women, there are available commercial genetic probes, which they provide direct, accurate, and rapid detection of the Neisseria gonorrhea from the clinical specimen. Okay, when it comes to treatment, it's treated with a broad-spectrum cephalosporin, and there are many different strains of Neisseria gonorrhea species which are resistant to many antimicrobial drugs, and in this case it can complicate the treatment. Prevention, as mentioned, it's safe sexual intercourse or practices with and avoidance of polygamy. All right, the next condition, it's also another very commonly heard condition known as syphilis. In Europe, syphilis, they firstly recognized syphilis very early, in 1400s, and this led some of the epidemiologists to hypothesize that the explorers, some of the Spanish explorers at that time, they brought the syphilis to Europe from other continents. And another hypothesis was that the causative bacterium, which evolved from a less pathogenic strain, endemy in North Africa, and that is the spread through Europe, was coincidental to Europeans' explorations of the New World. In any case, this sexually transmitted disease continues to afflict millions of people worldwide, even nowadays. And when it comes to the signs and symptoms, there are 4 different phases of syphilis. We have the primary syphilis, secondary syphilis, latent syphilis, and tertiary syphilis. We're going to mention a little bit each one of them. Okay, in this picture, what you see in here, you have different lesions of different phases of syphilis. Like, for instance, on the we start with the picture A up here. Okay, here we have a chancre, which is a hardened and painless lesion of the primary syphilis that forms at the site of infection. And here, in the picture, what you have in there is a shaft of a penis. The picture B, however, you have is pictured a widespread rash which characterizes secondary syphilis, and the C one is what we called as gumma, G-U-M-M-A. G-U-M-M-A, it's a characteristics of a tertiary syphilis, which is the 4th or the latest stage of syphilis. This is painful rubbery lesion, often occurs on the skin or the bone. So what you see in here, you can see the bone is slightly being seen from this picture. You can see in the deep lesions in there. Okay. However, when it comes to the tertiary syphilis or the gumma on the picture C, it is considered very rare in industrialized countries, and this is because the antimicrobial drugs are quite effective in treating syphilis, and progressive or late stage syphilis, such as tertiary syphilis, hardly occurs. Okay, Treponema pallidum is the major cause of syphilis, and that's it's a bacteria. It's a helical bacteria, which means it's in helical shape, and it's one of the spirochete group of bacteria, and it's quite narrow. It's quite narrow in size, around 0.1 micrometer, and they are very difficult to be seen by regular light microscope, like for instance when you do the gram staining. Therefore, majority of scientists use either phase contrast microscope or dark field microscope or special strains to increase the contrast. Graham states when it comes to the gram staining, usually it's not applicable method on doing on identifying the bacteria. Okay. It lives only in humans, and the virulence factor are quite hard to be identified. So basically, we do not exactly know what gives the power or that ability of the bacteria itself to cause the infection. When it comes to pathogenesis, because it is fastidious and very sensitive bacteria, Treponema pallidum, it must grow in humans and is transmitted almost solely via sexual contact. Now, reiterate again, it must be transmitted solely through sexual contact. Usually during the early stage of infection, when the spirochete are most numerous. The risk of infection from a single unprotected sexual contact with an infected partner is 10 to 30%. Treponema pallidum can also be spread from mother to fetus and rarely through blood transfusion. It cannot be spread by fomites such as toilet seats, eating utensils, clothing, etc. Okay, when it comes to epidemiology, it's a worldwide condition, endemic only among the sexual workers, men who have sexual intercourse with other men, and and also users of illegal drugs. The diagnosis: antibody tests are used for primary diagnosis, the secondary, as well as the congenital syphilis. For tertiary syphilis, it's difficult to diagnose until there is a presence of gumma, which is formed. And penicillin G is usually used for the treatment of all types of syphilis apart from the tertiary syphilis. And prevention is safe sex practices. Chlamydia infections is the next infection. Okay, it's the most common sexually transmitted bacterium known, as chlamydia trachomatis, and it causes several sexually transmitted and congenital diseases, including lymphogranuloma, venereum, and trachoma. Okay. When it comes to the signs and symptoms, about 85% of the chlamydial genital tract infections in women are asymptomatic. In contrast, more than 75% of infected men show signs and symptoms similar to those of the gonorrhea we mentioned earlier. Okay, chlamydia infection can also cause epididymitis, inflammation of the epididymis, or orchitis, inflammation of the testis, either of which can lead to sterility. When babies are infected at birth, an eye disease also, it can lead to an eye disease which is called as trachoma. Okay, trachoma, it's a disease of the eye, and usually it affects the babies, which is transferred from the mother's womb. And trachoma is the leading cause of non-traumatic blindness in humans worldwide. A severe form of chlamydial STD is also lymphogranuloma venereum, which is characterized by a transient genital lesion at the site of infections of on the penis, urethra, scrotum, vagina, cervix, or other external female genitalia. This is followed by a development of what we call as a bubo. It's a painfully inflamed lymph node in the groins, and it comes with fever, chills, anorexia, muscle pain, etc. And buboes, they may enlarge to the point that they rupture and producing draining sores. Okay, this is an example of an advanced case of lymphogranuloma venereum that we mentioned just earlier. All right. When it comes to the pathogen, I mentioned as well, it's chlamydia trachomatis. It's a non-motile and grow and multiply only within the vesicles inside the host cell. And the scientists once considered the chlamydia to be viruses, and this is one of the only bacteria which is very similar to the virus because of their very small size and intracellular lifestyle. Because for chlamydia, in order to multiply itself, they have to go, same as the virus, have to go inside the host cell. However, chlamydia are cellular and possess DNA and RNA and functional 70S ribosomes, which differs them from the microscope. They contain two membranes, which are similar to those of typical gram-negative bacteria, because gram-positive bacteria has only one membrane. And it surrounds each chlamydia cell, these two membranes, but there is no peptidoglycan in between the membranes. If you remember from the differences between gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, each bacteria they comprise of the peptidoglycan. Gram-positive, we have very thick peptidoglycan. Gram-negative, we have very thin peptidoglycan between the two membranes. And chlamydia, they do not have this peptidoglycan between their membranes. And they do not have a cell wall as well. So chlamydia has a unique development life cycle, which involves two cellular morphologies, both of which can occur within the phagosome of a host cell. And they are like tiny, in size 0.2 to 0.5, 0.4 micrometer. Okay, they are cocci in shape. They can as well be polymorphic, which means can have more than one morphology. Yeah. So okay. Okay, this one here is the development form and the life cycle of chlamydia we just mentioned. Okay, when it comes to the infections, the pathogenesis itself, the chlamydia trachomatis enters the body through scrapes and cuts and infects cells of the conjunctiva or cells lining the mucous membrane of the trachea, bronchi, urethra, ureterus, uterine tubes, anus, and rectum. Typically, the lesion at the site of the infection is overlooked because it is small and is painless and heals rapidly. Headache, muscle pain, and fever may occur during this stage of the disease. And proctitis may occur in men or women because of lymphatic spread of chlamydia from the genitalia or urethra to the rectum. And about 15% of the cases of proctitis in homosexual men result from the spread of chlamydia trachomatis via the anal intercourse. When it comes to the epidemiology, the pathogen may also be transmitted from eye to eye via droplets, hands, contaminated fomites, or via the flights, insects. So chlamydial eye infection are endemic in crowded, poor communities where the people have poor personal hygienes, inadequate sanitation, as well as inferior medical care. Particularly it's known to be an endemic in countries such as Middle East, Northern Africa, and India. Diagnosis and treatment and prevention. It's using the detection of chlamydial DNA using the PCR and treatment with various antimicrobial drugs, and prevention is hygiene by abstinence or mutual monogamy. Okay, another condition which I would like to go through is a chancroid. Chancroid is another underdiagnosed and unreported bacterial STD that is present in the United States. Even though it's underdiagnosed, it's a rare condition. Chancroid is characterized by soft, painful genital ulcers. Soft, painful genital ulcers. And there are around the chancres which are formed. They are around 4 to 50 millimeters in diameter. And these lesions which form at the site of infection are similar in appearance to primarily syphilitic lesions, which resemble syphilis. But syphilis lesions are painless and hard, and chancres are soft as well as painful ulcers. So the bacteria which is responsible, it's a Haemophilus ducreae. It produces toxins that kills the epithelial cells. And Haemophilus ducreae, it's very small. It's a coccobacillus, and it's a gram-negative bacteria which requires heme in order to grow. Okay, when it comes to and another thing to mention is Haemophilus ducreae. It's an obligate parasite which colonizes the humans only. Okay, pathogenesis and epidemiology. Most of the cases are cases in the United States are due to traveling. So it's considered one of the STDs, traveling diseases. Diagnosis is based on the presence of the lesion and the buboes that it forms, and is treated with various antibiotic drugs, and prevention is abstinence or mutual monogamy. And here we have a soft tissue, a soft chancres of chancroid. Uh, so what do the chancres have in common with primary syphilis lesions? What I mentioned earlier, uh, both chancres and syphilis lesions are located on genitalia and are manifestation of STD. However, the chancres are soft and are painful, and the syphilis lesions are hard and are painless. Okay, this is our last condition, which is the viral STDs. We're going into the genital herpes. The name herpes, which is derived from a Greek word, it means to creep. Okay, it's a descriptive of a slowly spreading skin lesion that are characteristic of a herpes infection. When it comes to the signs and the symptoms, the genital herpes, they manifest as numerous small blisters on the genitals, around the rectum, or in adjacent areas of the skin. The blisters, which are filled with clear straw-colored fluid, eventually they will break and they will become painful ulcers. The patients, they often experience fever, malaise, and myalgia, and decreases in appetite. And when it comes to the pathogen and the virulence factor, two enveloped polyhedral double-stranded DNA virus called human herpes virus, HHV. They come from the genus simplex virus. They cause a genital herpes. And these viruses, previously, they were known as herpes simplex virus. That's why in all literature, when you're looking for the herpes virus, you see that the virus responsible is HSV. However, the name has changed. Now we have it as HHV. And about 85% of these two herpes virus, which is herpes 2 and herpes 1, 85% of them infections is related to herpes virus 2, and herpes virus 2, HHV2, usually is called as below the waist herpes virus, and HSV1 is called oral herpes virus or cold sores because of the area where it infects, and HSV1 it's around 15% of the infections with HSV. Okay, HSV2 can also cause oral lesions. However, herpes virus can become latent in nerve cells and hiding the virus from the immune surveillance. And that's what leads to the prolongation of the disease. When it comes to the pathogenesis, the membrane of the herpes virus attaches to and fuses with the host cell's membrane, depositing the viral capsid and the genome in the cytosol. The viral genome enters the cell's nucleus and it replicates, and then it leaves the nucleus in the cytoplasm, it gets assembled, and it leaves the cell. This is a normal life cycle of the DNA viruses. Here we have a diagram depicting the sites of events in genital herpes infection. Infections occur when the herpes invades the lips. When the herpes invades the lips, the genitalia or the broken skin, viruses may remain latent for many years in the trigeminal nerves. We have the trigeminal nerves up here, and the virus may remain as a latent in there, in trigeminal nerves, in brachial nerves, or in sacral ganglia. Okay, and the three sites before traveling down to cause recurrent symptoms in the lips, genitalia, fingers, or the face. So, what factors may trigger the reactivation of the latent herpes virus and the occurrence of the symptoms? Usually, it's emotional stress, fever is one of them, trauma, sunlight, menstruation, mechanical irritation, fatigue, or other infections such as HIV symptoms. Okay, uh, here we have the herpes lesion of the eyes and the skin. In the figure A, we have the ophthalmic or ocular herpes results from reactivation of latent viruses in trigeminal ganglion. In picture B, we have a whitlow, which is an abscess of the soft tissue on a health provider's finger, resulting from the entry of herpes through a break in the skin of the finger. Okay. All right, we move to uh, the last slide for this lecture, which is the epidemiology of genital herpes. Genital herpes quadruples the risk of HIV infection. So those who are infected with HIV, there is an increase in the HIV infection because of the secondary infection with herpes virus. When it comes to the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention, diagnosis based on the characteristic lesions. Drugs such as antiviral drugs, acyclovir or any other antiviral agents can help with reducing the symptoms. Usually the circumcision among the males is one of the treatments which can reduce or can lower the risk of infection. Protection during the sexual intercourse such as condoms provide some additional protection as well. And if, let's say, the women who are infected with genital herpes and they are pregnant, in order to avoid the spreading of herpes from mother to the baby, the C-section delivery is recommended. And I think with this, we end today's chapter on the urinary tract as well as the reproductive system. So thank you very much. I hope every one of you has learned something from today's lecture, and good luck with the studies. Thank you.